Wits University scientists have been conducting lab experiments observing cacti growth under elevated carbon dioxide levels. It's suspected that carbon dioxide levels affect microbes living in the soil and could be causing the global decline of the insect population. Professor Marcus Byrne is from the School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Scientists. He joins us now to elaborate on the latest findings. Professor Byrne, it's great to have you with us this morning on what is an incredibly interesting story. I want to just take us to the issue around the dung beetles, which were added to this experiment. Just give us a sense of why the choice of this particular insect was added to the experiment, insofar as, you know, getting to the conclusions that you've come up with so far.
Morning, Michelle. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation. The inclusion of the dung beetles in that particular experiment was purely opportunistic. Mm-hmm. We were running an experiment at elevated CO2 levels, with the expectation that it would affect the way the cactus grew, and we are facing an increase in global CO2 across the planet. And we also happen to know a lot about dung beetles in my particular lab. And we thought, well, why don't we just put in some animals into the experiment and see what happens to them? And there was no expectation whatsoever that the CO2 would influence their development, but in fact it did.
So I want you to tell us how it influenced their development. And, you know, is the perception also that if it influences these dung beetles who are quite, shall we say, hard-wearing, that if it influences them in a particular way, the other microbes will no doubt face a worse fate?
Well, the reason for using dung beetles or using them as an example is it's a bit like a laboratory mouse or a fruit fly. There are certain animals that we know a great deal about, and therefore if we find a change in their behavior or their development, then we can extrapolate that to a lot of other animals. And the reason the dung beetles are very representative is because they spend a lot of their life underground, and many insects spend a big portion of their life underground. And that is where the influence of the CO2, we think, is taking place, is because it's not the CO2 directly affecting the beetle. The CO2 is affecting the microbes in the soil that surround the dung beetles as they develop. And because of the microbes competing for nutrients and possibly oxygen underground, we think that this influence will occur across the whole planet, with all those other animals, those other insects that also spend a large portion of their life underground.
So a few of them survived when they were added to the experiment. Those that did survive, emerging smaller.
Yeah, so those are the three main findings that we found. Were they took longer to develop at elevated CO2. They emerged smaller, and they were less likely to develop. And for a dung beetle to be small is a massive issue. I mean, it's a massive issue for many animals. But in dung beetles, size is not heritable. Size is influenced by the environment that they grow up in, normally the amount of food that is in the brood ball that they grow up in. But it being a small male dung beetle means that you're less likely to find a mate, and therefore it could actually influence their whole population structure as well.
Sure, very interesting indeed. In terms of the levels, the elevated levels of CO2 that were used in the experiment, were these comparable to real-life elevated levels, or were they exaggerated?
Good question. Both is the answer. We went back in time, so we used what we call subambient CO2 levels. So we went back to around about the 18th century, before industrialization. So we used a low CO2 level. Then we used the current CO2 levels, the ambient, which is 400 parts per million. Then we projected into the future 30 years, and we projected into the future 70 years. And really what's most disturbing is between the the historical level 200 years ago and the current level, we found a significant difference. So it suggests that the insects, the underground insects, are already under pressure from elevated CO2, and looking into the future, they're going to be under even more pressure. And this is important for all of us because these are the little animals that run our world. Insects are at the bottom of all these food chains, and they recycle nutrients, and they disturb the soil, they allow water into the soil. And if we upset this part of the ecosystem, we could be in trouble.
So what are we talking? That's actually my next question to you. What are the real life implications of where we're headed?
Yeah, you know, it's always the danger that the scientists throw up their hands and say, wow, the sky's falling. And what we're doing here is we're raising a flag and we're saying, we know that CO2 is massively important in terms of climate change, changing the temperature of our environment. The planet's getting hotter. But we also need to look down below the soil and say the CO2 is actually changing the ecosystem below the soil. And that's where we live. We live off the nutrients that come out of the soil because that's where we grow our crops. And if we upset that ecosystem, then we're going to have to deal with that as well. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's more pressure to control our CO2 output. We really need to curb our CO2.
Yeah. I mean, Prof, what do you do with the outcomes of experiments like this insofar as making the kinds of changes to reduce our CO2 output? What do you do with the results of this to make those changes?
Yeah, you know, for us, within our group, we throw up our hands and say, wow, this is exciting. But I think what the bigger point is that we spread it to as many people as possible, and we say, here is another reason why we should be looking at renewables and even possibly nuclear power as an alternative to our reliance on coal and carbon-based fuels. And we really have to take this climate change issue seriously and think about reducing our CO2 output. Yeah,
if we didn't know it already, more evidence now.
Exactly.
Professor Marcus Byrne, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM Report. Incredibly interesting discussion this. He's with the Wits School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences, a new study into the impact of rising carbon dioxide levels, taking us not only above ground, but below ground as well.